Welcome to Biopractice webinar on complaint handling in compliance with FDA and ISO regulations. The presenter for today's webinar is Jeff Kassoff, RAC CMQ-OE, Director of Quality Motivators. During the presentation, for any kind of questions, kindly post your questions in the chat box of your GoToMeeting tool, and the speaker would address those questions during the Q&A session. And now I would like to hand over to speaker Jeff Kassoff. Over to you, sir.
Hi, everyone. Let me welcome everyone to the webinar. For those of you who have not attended webinars in the past or maybe a little less experienced in webinars, I really think the only detriment, the only downside you're going to find is that we can't see each other. And the way I like to make up for that lack of face-to-face interaction is at the end of the session, obviously we will have a Q&A session. But what I'd like to do is feel free to treat it however you would like to treat it. If you feel that you would like to have a discussion on a particular topic as opposed to a pure question and answer session, I'm more than happy to do that. You all are my customer here, and I want to make sure you get what you want. Today's webinar, as many of you know, is complaint handling. And even if you have a model complaint handling system or MDO program that's fully in compliance, that's the best way to look at it is that's really only half the battle. You've got to make sure that you comply with your own requirements. You'll be cited from an external audit, either the supplier audit or a notified body, or even worse, an FDA representative. Similarly, whether you don't comply with your internal requirements as compared to external requirements, that's something that's very critical to remember. A non-compliance is a non-compliance. Looking at the agenda for today's presentation, we'll begin with the evolution of the regulations. I think it's always important to know kind of how you got to where you are. It's easier to understand that. Talk about the definition. I like to follow up definition in all of my webinars, not just this one, with how that definition is applied. I think it's critical that when we learn something, not just this webinar in particular, but when you learn something, you need to understand how it applies to you or your practice. Then I want to spend a few minutes speaking about non-compliance. What I find is that there are quite a few companies out there who waste their time on not necessarily going to call it a non-value added activity, because I'm not really talking continuous improvement or lean methodologies here. But if you handle a type of customer feedback as a complaint, and that customer feedback does not meet the regulatory definition of a complaint, you're wasting time. Then I want to talk about, then I'll visit a section which I like to title Complaints Must Be. Just a few requirements for complaints and a little explanation, elaboration on those. Then I want to talk about complaint investigation. The concept of the root cause investigation is not a new one at all, but what I find in my experience is that quite a few people fail to understand the necessity of the root cause investigation. Then we'll talk about closing complaints. I'm not going to give away any spoilers here, but you'll notice the word closing is in quotation marks. Then we'll talk about context of a complaint form. This is far less of a regulatory requirement and more or less of, based on my experience, what I find is useful when you have a complaint form, either manual or electronic, and the information is conveyed across your company to various people, what information everybody likes to see. Then I'll talk about complaint review and trending. Suffice it to say at this outline point that documenting complaints is not the last step in complaint handling. Each complaint has to be individually reviewed, and complaints should be trended on a periodic basis. Then I'll spend, admittedly, a few minutes, because we only have an hour here, talking about reportable events, the MDR event here in the States or the competent authority reportable event in the European community. And then we'll talk about the reporting requirements. It's important to understand that the complaint handling is required by both FDA and the European community, as are most regulations. Like the vast majority of regulations, complaint handling has always been a requirement from the first iteration of the quality system regs, which was called the GMPs, the Good Manufacturing Practices, and the very first version of ISO 1345, which was implemented in 1996. The reason I cite that is, quite honestly, far less significant now than it was 6 to 8 to 10 years ago. What I mean by that is